Last week I mentioned that I picked up a bargain-priced edition of the 10th anniversary, bargain-priced 10th anniversary edition of John Kabat-Zinn's mindfulness book on Wherever You Go, There You Are. Or at least that's the hope, wherever we go, there we are, because usually wherever we go, we're not there. Somewhere off in our heads. And we're talking about mindfulness, and what exactly that kind of mind is. You remember that koans say that ordinary mind is Buddha. If you know what ordinary mind is, most of us don't. Once again, we're not there in what's natural or ordinary, we're just off some other place. Or no mind, no Buddha, nothing that we can define, nothing that we can conceptualize, or nothing that conceptualizes, like our mind as it usually is it. So, remember we mentioned this, some of the phrases he used, it's not mindfulness, it's maybe heartfulness, or even bodyfulness. We mentioned that last week too. It's something that involves the whole of who we are, this kind of consciousness, because everything is conscious. Everything is consciousness at some level, to a certain level of energy vibration. As we have to connect to, or rather, wake up to, because we already are that. So today, let's look at some of the obstacles to that, or some other ways of looking how that might actually be accessible. I'd like to refer to something that's come up in the Franciscan Richard Rohr's. Here we are in a Franciscan house, so I often quote Richard Rohr, a mentor and friend of mine. Been speaking in recent days in his email messages about first and second gaze. I think it's a very good way of approaching what the challenge is for our mindfulness, for our waking up, for being truly present. He speaks about the first gaze, this really ordinary mind in the everyday bad sense. It's what we see normally, again, normally in terms of what actually happens, not what should be. Normally, we see with this first gaze, which is one of the greed, hatred, and ignorance that we carry around with us, or our traumas, or our prejudices, or our blinders, all the other images you want to use for what clouds or obscures or veils our vision. Our first gaze is usually one that comes from the ego, in this limited, narrow, fearful, calculating sense. As soon as we see something or someone or some event or something in our lives, and just try and catch yourself. Don't be too upset. You're going to find that almost constantly and immediately it's categorize it, judge it, decide whether is it good for me or not for me, should I, always in terms of how it relates to you in the narrow sense, which is not really you, of course, though many people think that is they, which is the tragedy. But meditation tries to wake us up, Zen tries to wake us up to realize that we're not that, but that's the enemy as we live it. In other words, always related to, should I be afraid of this? Should I desire this? What can I get out of it? How should I relate to this? Or this is good, or this is bad, or I'm better than he or she, or he or she is behaving ridiculously, or that shouldn't be. All these judgments, which are invariably superficial. Because the deeper you go, you realize that what is really there, and who especially is really there, is way beyond that. Because you also are way beyond that. We shouldn't be judging ourselves in that way either. We'll come back to that in a second. That's the second gaze. The second gaze is so hard to achieve because it's not instinctual. Again, in practice. And he remarks, Richard does, that's why the spiritual life is so much of an effort to constantly be aware, one reason we practice as much as we do, or should try to practice as much as we do, because it's so hard to overcome these mindsets, these instinctive, habitual reactions that we have, which prevent us from seeing what's really there, from being truly mindful and present. But that second gaze needs to become the first gaze. And the second gaze. It's just what the Catholic ascetical theology calls even the first movements of our feeling, of our being, and of our awareness are, as they put it, dedicated to God or consecrated to God. In Zen terms, meditation terms, what that means is fully awake, fully responsive to what's really there. Even the first gaze. So the second gaze should become the first gaze. What's the second gaze? The second gaze is, well, find out. What it comes down to is it's always a gaze of connection and compassion. Love, non-judgment, and appreciation. Whatever's there. Especially of whoever's there. And part of the problem, of our achieving that, is that, our judgments, as I say, get in the way. We want to feel superior, we want to condemn, or, our fragile ego is always trying to make itself superior. So, obviously, psychologically and spiritually, one of the problems is, where is that coming from, that kind of projection? It's coming from our own insecurity, from our own fear of our own inadequacy, which is, of course, true. The ego, in its narrow sense, as it understands itself, is totally inadequate. It's an illusion. Of course it's inadequate. But that's the problem. If we think that's who we are, then we're going to go out and judge and categorize and try to control and fear everybody else. So the first issue is to realize our connection, to realize that that's not who we truly are. Precisely in this book I was recently reading, this John Kabat-Zinn, the issue of self-esteem. Now notice how tricky that is. If you're trying to esteem the ego self, well, that's going to be a big trap. But the true self is the object of the second gaze, and the source of the second gaze, or deepest down self, which is Buddha, Christ, the Absolute, that is esteem for you and for everything, because it's God's love, Buddha's gaze, Buddha nature, whatever it is, in you. And he says something very interesting. He says when the Dalai Lama was presented by one of his interlocutors at a conference with the notion of self-esteem and low self-esteem in Western psychology, he didn't get it. He didn't understand what they were talking about, so they tried to translate it in various different ways. And finally, he said, oh, what a tragedy that is that we have this problem, self-esteem. So you see, in Eastern awareness, it's not an issue, because the ego is not real anyway, so why would you even bother trying to esteem that? And on the other hand, your true self is intrinsically esteemed and esteeming and estimable. So what's the issue? Well, it probably doesn't work out that way quite so neatly even for Eastern monks, but it's very telling. In other words, the first gaze of compassion, in other words, has to be on you. And in Christian terms, that means realize that God's gaze is always that second gaze, his first gaze, which is one of compassion and love. And here's where Richard loves to make his point, which is so important. Guilt and shame never come from God in Christian terms. In psychological terms, this guilt and shame is always something you have to work against, or work to overcome. And have this primary gaze of the whole universe on you, which becomes the universe's gaze in and through you to the rest of esteem, love, compassion. And that's the kind of connection that it feels, that's what it feels like. So for example, he suggests in the compassion, loving kindness meditation, which Tibetan Buddhists so often do, and is something we can do as well. You start with yourself, which isn't always done, even in the Eastern version. Maybe they don't need it, as we just said, but we do. Just we start by feeling that gaze of the universe on us and eventually through us to be one of compassion and love and acceptance. And that would be very healing for us. Realize that is the fundamental gaze. And that allows us to be then connected to everything else, and to everyone else, because it is the gaze of the universe. And we're all then connected. That's what our true self is. In that gaze of connection, love your neighbor as yourself, love one another as I have loved you. It's the very love of God, the love of the ultimate reality, which is us, ours. So we recognize that we're all connected in that way, in that circle, that cycle, that torrent of compassion. And he actually quotes in that chapter on loving kindness meditation, Cabot's in the John Donne poem. The two famous phrases in here, I didn't realize up until I looked at it today that it was part of the same poem. The two famous phrases, no man is an island, which of course is what Thomas Merton used as well in his work, which is the same point. We're not isolated. We're not fearful, isolated little selves. We're all connected in that one flow of compassion, which is the whole universe, which is Christ, Holy Spirit, what do we want to call it? It's the important thing is to experience as that ultimate consciousness, ultimate mindfulness, ultimate heartful, ultimate body force, which connects everything. But I'll just read the whole thing. No man is an island entire of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent, part of the main. If a cloud be washed away by the sea, Europe is the less, as well as if a promontory were. So nothing should be lost. Every person, every grain of sand is important. As well as if a manor of thy friends or of thine own were a manor house. Any man's death diminishes me, because I am involved in mankind. Here's of course, the famous second phrase, which another author, Ernest Hemingway, made famous. Therefore, never sends to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee. So any person's sadness, any person's grief, any person's suffering is our suffering. It's, of course, exactly what Christ is teaching. The hand is suffering, the whole body feels it, and we're the whole body of Christ. What if you do to the least of these, you do to me. We're all one. Whatever suffering is our suffering. And that's where compassion, the work of compassion comes in. We feel that. Grief is the garden of compassion. That's not mine, that's from Rumi. It's a little card I have on my desk at home. That's why I brought Rumi with me today. I'll read a poem in here too. And what cannot be said can be wept. That's not me either, that's Sappho, the ancient Greek poet. The lesbian one. Whatever cannot be said can be wept. That's another card I have on my desk. So, in other words, the ultimate reality, this love is compassion, is grief, but it's joy at the same time. What Brother Lentz a few weeks ago here in this very room called, speaking of icons, joyful sadness, which you can see in the face of the icons. Or which Richard Rohr calls in his book Falling Upward, a bright sadness. When you sing Gregorian chant, when you hear Gregorian chant, you feel that. It's a sadness, but it's a joy at the same time. That's the flavor of the ultimate reality. God's love, whatever you want to call it. That's what it feels like, and that's what it is. Ultimate compassion on you, and we just open ourselves to it. We let go of the ego, and follow what Teresa Lisieux calls that little way of just the pure openness. No pretensions, no need to achieve, no need to do anything ourselves with our ego that wants to always do this. We just, this receptivity to what we ultimately are. This love, this compassion, which reaches out. We all, that does connect us to all. And it can sometimes feel like grief and insufficiency, because it's pure poverty of spirit, pure emptiness. but there's a secret there. This is where Rumi comes in. This great poem which I just found today. It says, it's called Love Dogs. Let's see. One night a man was crying, Allah, Allah. His lips grew sweet with the praising, until a cynic said, so I've heard you calling out, but have you ever even gotten any response? The man had no answer to that. He quit praying and fell into a confused sleep. He dreamed he saw Kidir, the guide of souls, in the thick green foliage. Why did you stop praising? Because I never heard anything back. How often have I heard that? The response. This longing you express is the return message. This longing you express is the return message. The grief you cry out from draws you toward union. Your pure sadness that wants help is the secret cup. Listen to the moan of a dog for its master. That whining is the connection. There are love dogs no one knows the names of. Give your life to be one of them. Why is this longing you express, this grief, this emptiness, compassion, why is it the return message? Because that, once again, is the flavor, is ultimate reality. Ultimate reality is, as Zen says very well, emptiness. Emptiness in the sense of the fullness of pure giving, not holding on to anything, completely letting go. That emptiness cries out in us in the midst of grief or suffering. But that bright sadness is itself the end. That's why Christ on the cross is the revelation of God. Because that's what ultimate reality is. It's this bright sadness and compassion and joy and love. So that's what the second gaze feels like. Because that second gaze is God's consciousness, is ultimate reality, is emptiness, is the Buddha. And that love is what it's all about. There's that, remember the famous Avalokiteshvara, goddess, the god of compassion, or goddess of compassion in some traditions. And that the koan about, which I've often quoted about, reaching back at night to grab the pillow. That's what the god of compassion does. It's like you're asleep and you're reaching back instinctively for the pillow. That's what Rumi's talking about. It's at once the plea and the response. And it's instinctive. So intimacy with reality. Discover there's not a hair's breadth distance between us and anything else, is one of the koans. There's one of the great masters, 42nd koan in the Tenko says, what is it all about? Intimacy. No distance between anyone or anything. And to express that again, since someone mentioned it before, quote again what I quoted at the end of last week. That line from George Eliot, of all people. Everyone can be enlightened. About what it's like to be that intimate and that close, and that connected to reality as it is. Once again, if we had a keen vision and feeling of all ordinary human life, it would be like hearing the grass grow and the squirrel's heart beat. And we should dive that roar which lies on the other side of silence. The squirrel's heart would be our heart, beating silently with such a roar that we would die. Certainly our ego would die, which doesn't exist anyway, so it's become who you really are.